Don't click away, because what I'm about to tell you happened 3 nights ago, and I still can't sleep. A cemetery groundskeeper discovered 7 graves had been dug up and arranged in a perfect formation, all completed in under 3 hours with no machinery, and absolutely no one heard a single sound. The police didn't tell the media the most disturbing part, though. The caskets weren't just moved randomly, they were stacked 30 feet high like a house of cards with mathematical precision that would be impossible, even with a full construction crew and heavy equipment. Here's where it gets truly terrifying. The security cameras recorded everything except for those exact 3 hours when this impossible feat occurred, showing nothing but pure static during that time period. When investigators examined the crime scene, they found something so disturbing that seasoned detectives actually quit their jobs on the spot. There were fresh footprints in the dirt, but these weren't leading away from the graves like you'd expect. They were leading from the empty graves directly to the nearby houses where families were sleeping. I have the complete story that authorities tried to suppress. I have access to the police reports they attempted to bury. And I have 11 more bone-chilling tales just like this one, with each story becoming progressively more disturbing than the last. But before I share these terrifying accounts, I need to know that you can handle the absolute truth about what really happens when darkness falls across our world. If you're genuinely ready to discover the horrifying reality of what occurs during the night shift, when most people are safely asleep, then hit that subscribe button for Verified Fears immediately. Because once you hear these documented stories, you'll never be able to look at the darkness the same way again. Remember this warning: the dead don't always stay buried in their graves. And more importantly, they're definitely not always alone down there. Ronnie Martinez had always been a practical man, the kind who believed in what he could see and touch. So when his cousin offered him a night shift position at Sunset Manor Care Home, he jumped at the opportunity without asking too many questions. The pay was decent, better than his previous warehouse job. And the work seemed straightforward enough, just monitoring the facility overnight while the elderly residents slept peacefully in their beds. What could possibly go wrong in a place dedicated to caring for people in their golden years? The building itself was older, constructed sometime in the 1960s, with long, sterile hallways and fluorescent lighting that hummed constantly. But it had been well maintained, and the day staff seemed friendly enough during his brief orientation. His first few nights passed without incident, establishing a comfortable routine of hourly rounds through the residential wings, checking that all doors were secure and residents were resting comfortably. The facility housed about 40 elderly patients, most suffering from various stages of dementia or requiring assistance with daily activities. And during the night hours, they rarely stirred from their rooms. Ronnie had set up a small sleeping area in the staff break room, complete with a fold-out cot and a small television to help pass the quieter hours between his scheduled rounds. The break room was located at the center of the building, strategically positioned so he could hear if any residents needed assistance or if there were any unusual sounds throughout the facility. It was during his 4th night on the job when everything changed, transforming what had seemed like a peaceful and easy assignment into something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The evening had started normally enough, with Ronnie completing his 10 p.m. rounds and settling into the break room with a cup of coffee and a paperback novel he'd been trying to finish for weeks. The building was unusually quiet that night, with even the typical sounds of the heating system and settling walls seeming muted, creating an almost oppressive silence that made him feel isolated despite being surrounded by dozens of sleeping residents. At exactly 3:17 a.m., according to the digital clock on the break room wall, Ronnie heard something that made his blood run cold, and his hands shake so violently he dropped his coffee mug. sending hot liquid splashing across the linoleum floor. It was the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the hallway floor, but not in the way furniture might be moved or equipment wheeled from one location to another. This was different, more organic and deliberate, like someone crawling on their belly and pulling themselves forward using only their arms while their legs dragged uselessly behind them. The sound was coming from the east wing, the section of the building that housed the residents who required the most intensive care, and it was moving slowly but steadily in the direction of the break room where Ronnie sat frozen in terror. Each movement was accompanied by a soft scraping noise, as if clothing or fabric was being dragged against the rough surface of the floor. And occasionally he could swear he heard what sounded like labored breathing, the kind of desperate gasping someone might make if they were badly injured and struggling to move despite overwhelming pain. Ronnie's rational mind tried to explain away what he was hearing, suggesting that perhaps one of the residents had fallen and was trying to crawl back to their room. Or maybe a piece of equipment had come loose and was somehow moving on its own. But deep in his gut, he knew this was something else entirely. Something that defied logical explanation and made every instinct in his body scream at him to run as far and as fast as possible. The crawling sound continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, growing closer and more distinct until it seemed to be right outside the break room door. Grabbing his flashlight with trembling hands, Ronnie slowly approached the door and peered through the small window into the hallway beyond, expecting to see a resident who had wandered from their room or perhaps a maintenance issue that needed his attention. Instead, he found the hallway completely empty, illuminated only by the dim emergency lighting that cast long shadows along the walls. The crawling sound had stopped abruptly the moment he'd looked out, as if whatever was making the noise had somehow sensed his presence and decided to hide or retreat. Despite his fear, Ronnie's sense of responsibility to the residents compelled him to investigate further. So he opened the break room door and stepped into the hallway, sweeping his flashlight beam back and forth across the polished floor. The hallway was deserted, with all resident room doors closed and no signs of disturbance anywhere. But there was something else that made his skin crawl with unease. The air in the hallway felt different somehow, colder and heavier than it should have been, and there was a faint smell that he couldn't quite identify. Something metallic and unpleasant that reminded him of old pennies or rust. As he walked slowly down the corridor, checking each room and listening carefully for any sounds that might explain what he'd heard, Ronnie noticed something that made his heart race even faster. There were marks on the floor, barely visible in the dim lighting but definitely present, that looked like they could have been made by someone dragging themselves along the linoleum. The marks were subtle, just slight scuff patterns and what might have been moisture stains. But they formed a clear path from the far end of the east wing directly toward the break room where he'd been sitting. The remainder of that night passed in a haze of anxiety and hypervigilance, with Ronnie jumping at every small sound and constantly checking over his shoulder as he completed his rounds. He found himself avoiding the east wing whenever possible, taking longer routes through other parts of the building and making excuses to spend more time in well-lit areas where he felt safer. When his shift finally ended at 7 a.m. and the day staff began arriving, Ronnie was exhausted and shaken. But he decided not to mention what had happened, convincing himself that it must have been his imagination or perhaps the result of too much caffeine and too little sleep. However, the crawling sounds returned the following night. And the night after that, always at approximately the same time and always following the same path from the east wing toward the break room. Each occurrence lasted between 10 and 15 minutes, with the sounds growing progressively closer and more distinct, until Ronnie could swear he was hearing not just the dragging movement, but also soft whimpering and what sounded like fingernails scraping against the floor. The experience was becoming so traumatic that he was losing sleep during the day and considering quitting the job, despite desperately needing the income. On his 7th night at Sunset Manor, Ronnie finally worked up the courage to speak with his supervisor, Harold Brennan, a man in his 60s who had worked at the facility for over 20 years and seemed to know everything about its history and operations. Harold arrived early that morning, around 6:30 a.m., and found Ronnie sitting in the break room looking haggard and exhausted, staring at the spot on the floor where he'd been hearing the mysterious sounds night after night. "You look like hell, son," Harold said, pouring himself a cup of coffee and settling into the chair across from Ronnie. "Everything all right with the night shift? Any problems with the residents or equipment?" There was something in Harold's tone that suggested he might already know what Ronnie was going to say. A weariness that went beyond simple concern for an employee's well-being. Ronnie hesitated for a moment, unsure how to explain what he'd been experiencing without sounding completely insane, but finally decided that he had to tell someone or risk losing his mind entirely. He described the crawling sounds in detail, the timing and location, the path they seemed to follow, and the growing sense of dread that accompanied each occurrence. As he spoke, Harold's expression grew increasingly grave, and by the time Ronnie finished his account, the older man's face had gone completely pale. "Jesus Christ," Harold muttered, running his hands through his gray hair and staring at the floor. "I was hoping it wouldn't happen again, that maybe she'd finally found some peace. But I guess some things just don't stay buried." He looked up at Ronnie with eyes that held years of accumulated sorrow and guilt. "You deserve to know the truth about this place, about what happened in this room 3 years ago." Harold's story unfolded slowly, each detail more disturbing than the last, painting a picture of tragedy and violence that had left an indelible mark on Sunset Manor. 3 years earlier, a young woman named Sarah Chen had worked the night shift, performing the same duties that Ronnie now handled, making her rounds and sleeping in the same break room where they currently sat. Sarah had been 26 years old, a nursing student working nights to pay for her education, and by all accounts, she had been dedicated and well-liked by both staff and residents. On a cold February night, Sarah had been found dead in the break room by the morning shift supervisor, her body lying beside the same cot where Ronnie now slept. She had been shot 3 times, twice in the chest and once in the abdomen, and the crime scene suggested that she had been trying to crawl toward the door when the final shot was fired. The killer had never been identified or caught, despite an extensive police investigation that had lasted for months and involved interviews with dozens of staff members, residents' families, and anyone else who might have had access to the building. What made Sarah's murder even more tragic was the evidence that she had fought desperately for her life, managing to activate the facility's emergency alarm system before being shot. Though by the time police and paramedics arrived, it was far too late to save her. The crime scene investigators had found drag marks on the floor, indicating that Sarah had been wounded but still alive when she tried to crawl to safety, leaving a trail of blood that led from near the coffee machine to the spot beside the cot where her body was ultimately discovered. Harold explained that Sarah's murder had devastated the staff and residents of Sunset Manor, creating an atmosphere of fear and suspicion that had taken years to overcome. The facility had installed additional security measures, including better lighting and an upgraded alarm system. But the psychological impact of the tragedy had lingered long after the physical evidence had been cleaned away. Several employees had quit immediately after the incident, unable to work in a place where such violence had occurred, and it had taken months to fully staff the night shift again. "The thing is," Harold continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "you're not the first person to hear those sounds. 4 other night shift workers have reported the exact same thing over the past 3 years. Always the crawling noise, always at around 3 a.m., always following the same path from the east wing to this room. 2 of them quit immediately after their first experience. 1 lasted a week before he couldn't take it anymore. And the 4th guy thought he was losing his mind until I told him Sarah's story." The revelation that other people had experienced the same phenomena provided some relief to Ronnie, confirming that he wasn't suffering from sleep deprivation or psychological breakdown. But it also raised disturbing questions about what was actually happening in the building during those dark, early morning hours. Harold shared additional details that made the situation even more unsettling, including reports from day shift staff who claimed to feel cold spots in the break room and hallway, and residents who sometimes spoke about seeing a young woman walking through the corridors at night. Though these accounts were often dismissed due to the residents' cognitive impairments, one particularly chilling detail involved the facility's security cameras, which had been installed throughout the building after Sarah's murder, but seemed to malfunction specifically in the areas where the crawling sounds were heard. The cameras would work perfectly during normal operations, but during the times when night shift workers reported hearing the mysterious noises, the footage would show nothing but static, or would mysteriously cut out entirely, as if something was interfering with the electronic equipment. Harold also revealed that the east wing, where the crawling sounds always originated, had been Sarah's favorite area of the building because it housed several residents who had become particularly attached to her. She had often spent extra time with these patients, reading to them or simply sitting and talking when they couldn't sleep. And several family members had specifically mentioned how much their loved ones had appreciated Sarah's kindness and dedication. The fact that the mysterious sounds always began in this section of the building seemed to suggest a connection to Sarah's memory and the relationships she had formed with the residents there. As their conversation continued, Harold shared his own theory about what might be happening, though he admitted it sounded far-fetched even to him. He believed that Sarah's spirit was somehow trapped in the building, reliving her final moments over and over again, trying to crawl to safety that would never come. The timing of the sounds, always around 3 a.m., corresponded closely to the estimated time of Sarah's murder, and the path they followed matched exactly the route she had taken during her desperate attempt to escape her attacker. "I know how crazy it sounds," Harold said, "but I've been in this business for over 40 years. And I've learned that there are things in this world that can't be explained by logic or science. Places where terrible things happen sometimes hold on to that energy, that pain and fear, and it manifests in ways that defy understanding. Maybe Sarah's spirit is trying to tell us something, or maybe she's just lost and can't find her way to whatever comes next." The conversation with Harold provided Ronnie with a framework for understanding his experiences, but it didn't make the nightly encounters any less terrifying. If anything, knowing the tragic backstory made the crawling sounds even more disturbing, transforming them from mysterious noises into the echoes of a young woman's final desperate moments. The idea that Sarah's spirit might be trapped in an endless loop of trauma and fear was heartbreaking. But it also raised questions about whether there was anything that could be done to help her find peace. Over the following weeks, Ronnie developed a complex relationship with the phenomenon, feeling simultaneously terrified and protective of what he now believed to be Sarah's spirit. He began speaking softly to the empty hallway during his rounds, telling Sarah that she was safe now and that her killer couldn't hurt her anymore, though he wasn't sure if his words had any effect. Sometimes the crawling sounds seemed less frantic after these one-sided conversations. But that might have been his imagination or wishful thinking. The experience fundamentally changed Ronnie's perspective on life and death, forcing him to confront the possibility that consciousness might persist beyond physical existence in ways that science couldn't yet explain. He found himself researching paranormal phenomena and reading accounts of similar experiences in other locations, discovering that hospitals, nursing homes, and other places where people died were often associated with unexplained sounds, apparitions, and other mysterious occurrences. Despite the ongoing supernatural encounters, Ronnie chose to continue working at Sunset Manor, partly because he needed the job, but also because he felt a strange sense of responsibility towards Sarah's memory and the residents who depended on his care. He developed strategies for coping with the nightly sounds, including playing soft music during his rounds and keeping lights on in areas where he felt most uncomfortable. But the crawling noises continued with clockwork regularity, a nightly reminder of the tragedy that had occurred within those walls. The story of Sarah Chen and her lingering presence at Sunset Manor became a defining experience in Ronnie's life, challenging his assumptions about reality and forcing him to accept that some mysteries might never be solved. Whether the sounds he heard were truly the spirit of a murdered young woman or some other unexplained phenomenon, they served as a constant reminder that death doesn't always bring the peace and closure that the living hope for, and that some wounds run so deep they leave permanent scars on the places where they occurred. Let's move to our second story, and this one will make you question everything you think you know about desperation and the lengths people will go to for money. Gwen had been struggling financially for months, working multiple part-time jobs just to keep her head above water. So when her friend called with an emergency overnight shift opportunity at a place called the All Tucked Inn, she didn't hesitate to say yes despite never having worked at a motel before. The pay was surprisingly good for such short notice, almost too good. But Gwen was in no position to ask questions when her rent was due in 3 days and her bank account was nearly empty. The All Tucked Inn turned out to be exactly what she had expected from the name. A rundown roadside motel that had seen better days decades ago, with peeling paint on the exterior walls and a neon sign that flickered intermittently in the gathering dusk. The parking lot was mostly empty, except for a few cars that looked like they hadn't moved in weeks. And the entire property had an air of abandonment that made Gwen wonder how the place stayed in business. When she knocked on the office door, she was greeted by Teddy, the owner, a nervous middle-aged man who seemed unusually eager to hand over the keys and leave as quickly as possible. Just answer the phone if it rings, check in any late arrivals, and keep an eye on things, Teddy said, practically bouncing on his feet as he gathered his belongings. I've got a date tonight, first one in months, and I really can't cancel. He thrust a ring of keys into Gwen's hands, along with a hastily written list of instructions, most of which seemed to involve not bothering him unless the building was literally on fire. There was something about his urgency that struck Gwen as odd, almost as if he was desperate to get away from the motel before darkness fell completely. As Teddy's car disappeared down the highway, leaving Gwen alone with the flickering neon sign and the sound of wind whistling through the gaps in the building's siding, she began to understand why the previous clerk might have quit without notice. The motel office was cramped and outdated, with wood paneling that had probably been installed in the 1970s and a registration desk that wobbled whenever she leaned against it. Behind the building, where a swimming pool had once provided entertainment for guests. There was now just a gaping sinkhole filled with stagnant water and debris, surrounded by yellow caution tape that had been there so long it was faded and torn. The first few hours of Gwen's shift passed quietly enough, with only one guest checking in around 9 p.m., a traveling salesman who seemed more interested in getting to his room quickly than making conversation. She spent most of her time reading a paperback novel she'd brought along and occasionally glancing at the small television in the corner that received only 3 channels, all of them showing late-night reruns of shows she didn't recognize. The building creaked and settled around her as the temperature dropped, creating a symphony of small noises that gradually became part of the background ambiance. It was around 11:30 p.m. when Gwen first noticed something that made her put down her book and pay closer attention to her surroundings. Out of the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse of movement near the sinkhole behind the building, just a shadow that seemed to shift and change shape in ways that didn't match the movement of the trees or the scattered debris. When she looked directly at the area through the office window, everything appeared normal. But the moment she returned her attention to her book, the peripheral movement would start again, always just beyond the edge of her direct vision. The sensation of being watched grew stronger as the night progressed, making Gwen increasingly uncomfortable, despite her attempts to rationalize what she was experiencing. She told herself that it was probably just fatigue combined with the stress of working in an unfamiliar environment. But deep down, she knew that something was genuinely wrong with the All Tucked Inn. The building itself seemed to have a malevolent presence, as if years of transient guests and questionable activities had left a psychic residue that permeated every surface and corner. Around 1 a.m., Gwen's unease transformed into genuine fear when she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the gravel outside the office, slow and deliberate, as if someone was walking around the building in a careful pattern. She peered through the windows, but saw nothing in the dim light cast by the flickering neon sign. Yet the footsteps continued for several minutes before finally stopping directly outside the office door. For nearly 10 minutes, Gwen sat frozen behind the registration desk, waiting for a knock or some other indication of what the person outside wanted. But the silence stretched on until she began to wonder if she had imagined the entire thing. When she finally worked up the courage to check the door, she found it securely locked with no signs that anyone had been there. But the feeling of being observed had intensified to the point where she could barely concentrate on anything else. Every shadow seemed to contain a hidden figure. Every sound suggested the presence of someone or something that shouldn't be there. And the air itself felt heavy, with an oppressive energy that made breathing difficult. Gwen found herself constantly checking the locks on the doors and windows, though she couldn't have explained what she was trying to keep out. The situation escalated dramatically around 2:30 a.m., when the small television in the corner suddenly switched to a local news broadcast. Despite the fact that Gwen hadn't touched the remote control, and the channel had been showing an old movie just moments before, the news anchor was reporting on a prison break that had occurred earlier that evening, describing how a convicted murderer named Marcus Webb had escaped from a minimum security facility about 50 miles away and was considered extremely dangerous. The man's photograph filled the screen, showing a gaunt face with cold eyes and a scar running from his left temple to his jaw. And the reporter emphasized that anyone who saw him should call police immediately rather than attempting to approach him. As the news report continued with details about the escaped prisoner's criminal history, which included multiple counts of assault and one particularly brutal murder that had occurred during a robbery gone wrong, Gwen felt her blood turn to ice in her veins. The description of Marcus Webb's preferred method of operation breaking into isolated businesses during overnight hours and attacking lone employees, matched her current situation almost perfectly. The reporter mentioned that Webb was likely to target gas stations, convenience stores, or small motels where he could find both money and potential victims, and that he had a history of extreme violence when confronted or cornered. The television report concluded with a warning that Webb was believed to be traveling on foot and could be anywhere within a 100-mile radius of the prison, followed by a phone number for people to call if they had any information about his whereabouts. As the broadcast returned to regular programming, Gwen realized that she was completely alone in an isolated motel with minimal security, no nearby neighbors, and no way to quickly summon help if something went wrong. The nearest police station was at least 20 minutes away, and her cell phone showed only 2 bars of signal strength, hardly reliable for an emergency call. Gwen's first instinct was to call Teddy and demand that he return immediately. But when she tried his number, it went straight to voicemail, and her increasingly frantic messages went unanswered. She considered abandoning her post and driving home, but she desperately needed the money from this job, and she knew that walking out without a valid reason would mean never getting paid and probably never finding work through this temp agency again. Instead, she decided to barricade herself in the office as best she could, moving furniture in front of the door and keeping all the lights on to make the building appear occupied and alert. As the hours crawled by with agonizing slowness, every sound outside the office sent Gwen's heart racing. From the rustle of wind through the trees to the distant sound of cars passing on the highway, she found herself staring at the sinkhole behind the building, which seemed to have taken on a sinister significance in light of the news about the escaped prisoner. The dark water at the bottom of the hole could easily conceal evidence of criminal activity, and the isolated location of the motel would make it an ideal place for someone like Marcus Webb to hide while planning his next move. Around 4 a.m., Gwen's worst fears seemed to be confirmed when she heard the unmistakable sound of a car door slamming somewhere in the parking lot, followed by footsteps approaching the office. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone to call 911, but before she could dial, a voice called out from outside, asking if the motel had any available rooms for the night. The voice sounded normal enough, but something about its tone made Gwen hesitate, and she decided to remain silent rather than revealing her presence to whoever was outside. The person outside tried the office door handle several times, rattling it against the lock before walking around the building and testing the windows. Gwen crouched behind the registration desk, hardly daring to breathe, as she listened to the sounds of someone systematically checking every possible entry point. The footsteps paused directly outside the window where she was hiding, and for a terrifying moment, she was certain that whoever was out there could see her despite the furniture she had piled against the glass. After what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the footsteps moved away from the office and toward the guest room section of the motel, where Gwen could hear doors being tested and occasionally forced open. She realized with growing horror that the intruder was methodically searching the entire property, possibly looking for money, valuables, or victims, and that it was only a matter of time before he returned to the office with a more determined effort to gain entry. The sound of breaking glass from one of the guest rooms confirmed her worst fears about the intruder's intentions and capabilities. When dawn finally began to break over the horizon, casting pale light across the motel parking lot, Gwen felt like she had aged years in a single night. The sounds of the intruder had stopped around 5 a.m., but she remained hidden behind the registration desk until she saw Teddy's car pulling into the parking lot at exactly 7 a.m., right on schedule. When he entered the office and found her crouched behind the desk, surrounded by furniture and looking like she had seen a ghost, His expression immediately shifted from casual greeting to serious concern. "What the hell happened here?" Teddy asked, taking in the barricaded windows and Gwen's obvious state of distress. When she explained about the escaped prisoner news report and the intruder who had spent hours trying to break into the building, Teddy's face went pale and he immediately called the police to report the incident. The responding officers found evidence of forced entry in 3 guest rooms and footprints around the building that matched the description of Marcus Webb's boots, confirming that Gwen had indeed spent the night in mortal danger. The police investigation revealed that Marcus Webb had been captured later that morning, about 10 miles from the All-Tucked Inn, carrying items stolen from the guest rooms and admitting under questioning that he had been planning to break into the office, but had been deterred by what he described as too much activity inside the building. Gwen's decision to keep the lights on and barricade herself inside had probably saved her life, though the psychological impact of the experience would stay with her for months afterward. When Teddy offered her a permanent position at the motel with significantly higher pay, Gwen politely declined, explaining that she never wanted to spend another night alone in that place, regardless of how much money was involved. The All-Tucked Inn had taught her that some jobs, no matter how desperately needed, simply weren't worth the risk, and that sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who walk on 2 legs and hunt in the darkness when their potential victims are most vulnerable and isolated. Let's move to our 3rd story. And this one takes place in the sterile, fluorescent-lit corridors of a hospital where death is supposed to be final. But sometimes the boundary between life and death becomes terrifyingly blurred. Marcus had been working as a medical equipment technician for over 15 years, specializing in the removal and maintenance of life support systems, ventilators, and monitoring devices. So he thought he had seen everything that hospitals could throw at him. His job required him to work primarily during night shifts, when patient disruptions would be minimal. And he had developed a routine that allowed him to efficiently service equipment while respecting the dignity of patients and their families during difficult times. The call came in around 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday night, requesting immediate equipment removal from room 314 in the cardiac wing, where an elderly patient named Robert Henley had passed away 3 hours earlier after a prolonged battle with heart failure. Marcus gathered his tools and headed to the room, expecting a routine procedure that would take perhaps 30 minutes to complete, involving the careful disconnection and removal of the various machines that had been keeping Mr. Henley alive during his final weeks. The family had already said their goodbyes and left the hospital, and the nursing staff had prepared the body according to standard protocols, placing it in a black body bag on the bed while they waited for the funeral home to arrive. Room 314 was dimly lit when Marcus entered, with only the soft glow from the hallway providing illumination as he began his work methodically disconnecting the heart monitor, ventilator, and IV pumps that surrounded the bed. The body bag lay still and silent on the mattress, and Marcus had performed this same procedure hundreds of times before. So he worked efficiently and respectfully, coiling cables and preparing each piece of equipment for transport back to the maintenance department. The room felt unusually cold, which he attributed to the air conditioning system running at full capacity. And there was a strange heaviness in the air that made him feel slightly uncomfortable, though he couldn't pinpoint exactly why. Marcus had just finished disconnecting the last piece of monitoring equipment and was preparing to wheel the ventilator out of the room when he noticed something that made him stop dead in his tracks and question his own sanity. Every single piece of equipment that he had just disconnected and prepared for removal was back in its original position around the bed, with all cables connected and all machines humming quietly as if they had never been disturbed. The heart monitor showed a steady rhythm. The ventilator was cycling normally, and the IV pump was delivering fluids at the prescribed rate, exactly as they had been when Mr. Henley was alive. For several minutes, Marcus stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the impossible scene before him and trying to process what he was seeing with his rational, technically trained mind. He had definitely disconnected every machine, he had coiled every cable, and he had been preparing to remove the equipment from the room. Yet somehow everything was back exactly as it had been when he first entered. The body bag still lay motionless on the bed, showing no signs of life or movement. But the machines around it were functioning, as if they were still supporting a living patient. Marcus approached the equipment cautiously, checking each machine's display panel and finding that they were all showing normal readings, as if connected to a healthy, stable patient rather than a deceased body in a bag. The heart monitor displayed a regular sinus rhythm at 72 beats per minute. The ventilator showed appropriate tidal volumes and oxygen saturation levels. And the IV pump indicated that medications were being delivered according to the prescribed schedule. When he traced the cables and tubes, they all led directly to the body bag, disappearing beneath the black plastic as if somehow connected to Mr. Henley's lifeless form. The rational part of Marcus's mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation for what he was experiencing. Perhaps equipment malfunction or some kind of electrical feedback that was causing false readings. But when he opened the body bag to investigate, he found Mr. Henley's body exactly as the nursing staff had left it, with no signs of life and no visible connections to any of the medical equipment. The man's skin was cold and pale, his eyes were closed, and there was no pulse or breathing. Yet the machines continued to register vital signs as if they were monitoring a living person. Marcus decided to repeat the disconnection process, this time paying even closer attention to each step and making sure that every cable and tube was completely separated from its connection point. He worked slowly and methodically, double-checking each disconnection and physically removing cables from the room to ensure they couldn't somehow reconnect themselves. When he finished, he stood in the doorway and watched the equipment for several minutes, waiting to see if the impossible reconnection would happen again. At exactly 3:17 a.m., according to the digital clock on the wall, Marcus witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his career and fundamentally change his understanding of the relationship between life, death, and the technology that bridges the gap between them. As he watched in stunned silence, cables began moving on their own, snaking across the floor like living things and reconnecting themselves to the appropriate ports and connections. The process was smooth and deliberate, as if invisible hands were performing the reconnections with the skill and knowledge of an experienced medical technician. The heart monitor came online first, immediately displaying the same steady rhythm it had shown before, followed by the ventilator, which began cycling with the exact same settings and parameters that had been programmed for Mr. Henley during his treatment. The IV pump resumed its quiet operation, and within minutes, all of the equipment was functioning exactly as it had been when Marcus first entered the room, showing vital signs and readings that suggested a living, breathing patient despite the obvious presence of a deceased body in the bag. Marcus tried disconnecting the equipment a third time, and then a fourth. But each time the same impossible reconnection occurred at exactly 3:17 a.m., as if some force was determined to maintain the illusion that Mr. Henley was still alive and still in need of medical support. The precision and consistency of the phenomenon ruled out any possibility of equipment malfunction or coincidence. leaving Marcus to confront the terrifying possibility that he was witnessing something supernatural, something that defied every law of physics and medical science he had ever learned. As the night progressed, Marcus began to notice other disturbing details that added layers of horror to an already inexplicable situation. The room temperatures seemed to fluctuate wildly, dropping to near freezing levels whenever the equipment reconnected itself, then gradually warming back to normal hospital temperature over the following hour. The air in the room developed a strange quality, becoming thick and oppressive, as if filled with an invisible presence that made breathing difficult and created a sense of being watched by unseen eyes. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that began emanating from the body bag during the periods when the equipment was connected and functioning. Soft whispers that might have been mistaken for the normal sounds of medical equipment, but which seemed to form words and phrases when Marcus listened carefully. The whispers were too quiet to understand clearly, but they had the rhythm and cadence of human speech, as if Mr. Henley was trying to communicate something important from beyond the boundary of death. Marcus attempted to record the phenomenon using his cell phone, hoping to capture evidence that would help him convince others of what he was experiencing. But every recording came out as nothing but static and electronic interference. The hospital's security cameras in the hallway outside room 314 mysteriously malfunctioned during the hours when the equipment reconnections were occurring, showing only blank screens or distorted images that provided no useful documentation of the events. By 5 a.m., Marcus had given up trying to remove the equipment and instead focused on documenting everything he could remember about the experience, writing detailed notes about the timing, the specific equipment involved, and the various phenomena he had witnessed. He realized that he was probably the only person who would ever believe his account of what had happened in room 314. But he felt compelled to create a record of the events, if only for his own peace of mind and sanity. When the day shift arrived at 7 a.m., Marcus attempted to explain what had happened to his supervisor, but the equipment was found disconnected and ready for removal, exactly as it should have been after a routine service call. There was no evidence of the repeated reconnections, no record of the false vital signs, and no indication that anything unusual had occurred during the night. His supervisor listened politely, but clearly thought that Marcus had been working too many night shifts and was suffering from fatigue-induced hallucinations. The funeral home arrived later that morning to collect Mr. Henley's body, and the room was cleaned and prepared for the next patient. But Marcus never forgot what he had experienced in those dark hours between 2:30 and 7 a.m. He continued working night shifts at the hospital for several more years, but he never again volunteered for equipment removal duties in room 314. And he always felt a chill of recognition whenever he passed that particular door in the cardiac wing. The experience fundamentally changed Marcus's perspective on death and the possibility of consciousness persisting beyond physical life, forcing him to consider that the boundary between life and death might be far more permeable than medical science acknowledges. He began researching similar accounts from other hospital workers and discovered that equipment malfunctions and unexplained phenomena were surprisingly common in rooms where patients had died, particularly in cases where the death had been prolonged or traumatic. Marcus eventually concluded that Mr. Henley's spirit had somehow become attached to the medical equipment that had sustained his life during his final weeks, creating a supernatural connection that persisted even after his physical death. The repeated reconnections might have been the spirit's attempt to maintain the familiar routine of medical care, or perhaps a desperate effort to communicate something important to the living world. Whatever the explanation, the experience served as a powerful reminder that death is not always the final, definitive end, that we assume it to be, and that some connections between the living and the dead transcend the boundaries of physical existence. Let's move to our fourth story. And this one involves a security guard whose routine night shift turned into a nightmare that would haunt him for the next 12 years and counting. Thomas Mitchell had been working security for various companies around New York City since the early 2000s. And he thought he had seen every possible scenario that could unfold during the overnight hours in a busy metropolitan area. He had dealt with break-ins, medical emergencies, false alarms, and even the occasional domestic dispute that spilled over into the office buildings he was hired to protect. But nothing in his extensive experience had prepared him for what he would encounter on a seemingly ordinary Tuesday night in October 2012. The assignment seemed straightforward enough when Thomas received the call from his supervisor around 6 p.m., requesting that he cover an emergency shift at a mid-rise office building in Lower Manhattan, where the regular security guard had called in sick at the last minute. The building housed several small businesses, including accounting firms, legal offices, and consulting companies. The kind of white-collar operations that typically generated very little security-related activity during overnight hours. Thomas had worked in similar buildings dozens of times before, and he expected nothing more challenging than a few routine perimeter checks and perhaps some paperwork to keep him occupied until the morning shift arrived. The building itself was unremarkable, constructed sometime in the 1980s with the kind of generic architectural style that characterized much of the 1980s commercial development from that era, featuring a marble-clad lobby, fluorescent-lit hallways, and the standard array of security cameras and access control systems. Thomas's duties were clearly defined in the instructions left by the regular guard. Hourly walks through all 12 floors, monitoring of the security camera feeds from the lobby desk, and maintaining a log of any unusual activities or observations throughout the night. For the first several hours of his shift, everything proceeded exactly as Thomas had anticipated, with the building remaining quiet and secure, while the city bustled with activity outside the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered panoramic views of the Manhattan skyline. He completed his initial rounds without incident, familiarizing himself with the layout of each floor and noting the locations of emergency exits, fire extinguishers, and other safety equipment that might be relevant in case of an emergency. The building's tenants had all departed by 7 p.m., leaving behind the typical detritus of a busy workday. Coffee cups on desks, computers in sleep mode, and the lingering smell of takeout food from various lunch meetings. It was during his 11 p.m. rounds that Thomas first noticed something that struck him as unusual, though not necessarily alarming at the time. As he walked through the 8th floor, which housed a prestigious law firm specializing in corporate litigation, he observed that one of the corner offices had its lights on despite the fact that all employees should have left hours earlier. The office belonged to the firm's senior partner, according to the nameplate on the door, and through the glass walls that were common in modern office design, Thomas could see that someone was sitting motionless in the executive chair behind the large mahogany desk. Thomas's initial assumption was that the senior partner was working late on an important case, which wasn't uncommon in high-pressure legal environments. So he made a note in his security log and continued with his rounds without disturbing what he assumed was a dedicated attorney burning the midnight oil. However, something about the figure in the chair bothered him in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps the complete stillness of the person or the unnatural way they were positioned. But he dismissed these concerns as products of his imagination and the inherent eeriness of empty office buildings at night. When Thomas returned to the 8th floor for his midnight rounds, the lights in the corner office were still on, and the figure was still sitting in exactly the same position behind the desk, apparently unchanged from his previous observation an hour earlier. This time, Thomas decided to investigate more closely, approaching the office door and knocking gently to announce his presence before peering through the glass to get a better look at the late working attorney. What he saw made his blood run cold and his hands shake so violently that he nearly dropped his flashlight on the polished marble floor. The man in the executive chair appeared to have passed away under disturbing circumstances. His posture was unnaturally slumped, and the office bore the chaotic signs of a struggle. Papers littered the floor, furniture was askew, and an oppressive stillness hung in the air. Whatever had happened here was clearly traumatic, leaving behind a chilling scene that would linger in Thomas's memory for years. What made Thomas's discovery even more disturbing was the realization that this man had been in this condition for hours, possibly since before Thomas had even arrived for his shift. Yet somehow, he had failed to notice the obvious signs of tragedy during his previous rounds. The complete stillness that had bothered him earlier now made perfect sense. But it also raised troubling questions about his own observational skills and professional competence. Thomas immediately called 911 from his cell phone, his voice shaking as he reported the discovery to the emergency dispatcher and requested immediate response from both police and paramedics. Though it was clear that medical intervention would be futile given the obvious nature of the situation. While waiting for the authorities to arrive, Thomas secured the area around the office and began reviewing the security camera footage from the lobby and hallway cameras, hoping to determine when and how the victim had gained access to the building after normal business hours. The police investigation later identified the deceased as 58-year-old attorney Michael Brennan, a longtime tenant of the building. Reports indicated he had been dealing with significant personal and professional challenges in the months leading up to his death. For Thomas, the incident was a sobering reminder that behind the polished facades of success, people often carried invisible burdens. It also reinforced the idea that the buildings he was hired to protect could harbor deeply human stories, ones far more complicated and tragic than the typical incidents he was trained to handle. The experience fundamentally changed Thomas's approach to security work, making him more attentive to subtle signs that something might be amiss and more aware of the human stories that played out in the buildings he patrolled during the lonely hours of the night shift. The image of Michael Brennan sitting motionless in that executive chair became a permanent fixture in Thomas's memory, serving as a reminder that death could visit even the most prestigious offices, and that sometimes the greatest tragedies occurred in silence, witnessed only by those brave enough to work when the rest of the world was asleep. Let's move to our fifth story, and this one involves a security guard who encountered something that challenged every assumption he had about human behavior and the nature of reality itself. James Patterson had been working security for almost 8 years, primarily covering commercial properties and office complexes throughout the greater Chicago area. And he prided himself on his ability to handle any situation with professionalism and calm authority. His experience had taught him to expect the unexpected, from dealing with intoxicated individuals to managing medical emergencies. But nothing in his extensive training had prepared him for the encounter that would forever change his understanding of what was possible during the dark hours of the night shift. The incident occurred on a frigid February evening when James was assigned to patrol a sprawling industrial complex on the outskirts of the city, a collection of warehouses and manufacturing facilities that had been largely abandoned since the economic downturn of 2008. Most of the buildings stood empty, their broken windows and rusted loading docks serving as monuments to the area's former prosperity. But a few smaller businesses still operated out of the complex, requiring minimal security coverage to protect their equipment and inventory from vandalism and theft. James had worked this particular site several times before and found it to be generally quiet, with the main security concerns being occasional break-ins by scavengers looking for copper wire or other valuable materials they could sell. Around 11:30 p.m., while conducting his routine exterior patrol of the complex, James noticed that one of the supposedly vacant warehouses had a hole punched through its corrugated metal siding, approximately 3 feet in diameter, and positioned about 4 feet above ground level. The hole appeared to be fresh, with jagged metal edges that gleamed in the beam of his flashlight, and there were scuff marks on the concrete foundation below that suggested someone had recently climbed through the opening. James's first thought was that he had discovered evidence of a break-in in progress, so he immediately radioed his supervisor to report the situation and request backup before approaching the building to investigate further. As James moved closer to examine the hole in the warehouse wall, he heard sounds coming from inside the building that made him pause and reconsider his approach strategy. Instead of the typical noises associated with burglary or vandalism, such as the sound of tools being used or materials being moved, he heard what could only be described as scratching or scraping, as if someone was dragging themselves across the concrete floor using only their fingernails. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, suggesting purposeful movement rather than random activity. But there was something profoundly unsettling about the quality of the noise that made James's skin crawl with instinctive revulsion. Against his better judgment and standard security protocols, James decided to investigate the source of the sounds before backup arrived, reasoning that a single intruder posed minimal threat to an experienced security professional, and that early intervention might prevent significant property damage or theft. He squeezed through the hole in the warehouse wall, finding himself in a vast, empty space, illuminated only by the pale moonlight, filtering through grimy skylights in the ceiling high above. The concrete floor was covered with a thin layer of dust and debris that had accumulated during years of abandonment, and James could clearly see drag marks in the dust that formed a serpentine pattern leading from the hole in the wall toward the far end of the warehouse. Following the drag marks with his flashlight beam, James called out in his most authoritative voice, identifying himself as security personnel and demanding that whoever was in the building show themselves immediately. Instead of a verbal response or the sound of someone attempting to flee, James heard the scraping noise intensify and change direction, as if the person making the sound was now moving directly toward his position rather than away from it. The realization that the intruder was approaching rather than retreating sent a chill of fear through James's body, violating every expectation he had about how people typically respond when confronted by security personnel. As the scraping sound grew closer, James aimed his flashlight toward the source of the noise and witnessed something that would haunt his dreams for years to come. A human figure was indeed moving across the warehouse floor, but not in any manner that James had ever seen before or could have imagined possible. The person was crawling on all fours, but their movement was wrong in ways that defied anatomical logic. With joints bending in directions that should have been impossible and limbs moving in a coordination pattern that suggested either severe injury or something far more disturbing than simple human locomotion. The figure's head was covered by what appeared to be a crude mask made from some kind of animal hide, possibly pigskin based on its texture and coloration, and the eye holes had been cut irregularly, giving the mask a grotesque, asymmetrical appearance that reminded James of the twisted imagery from horror movies like Saw. But this was no movie prop or Halloween costume. This was something real and immediate and terrifying, moving toward him with a determination that suggested predatory intent rather than simple mischief or mental illness. James's training kicked in despite his shock and revulsion, and he immediately began backing toward the hole in the wall while keeping his flashlight trained on the approaching figure and reaching for his radio to call for immediate emergency backup. However, the figure's movement was faster than James had anticipated, covering the distance between them with an efficiency that seemed to defy the awkward crawling motion. And within seconds, the masked intruder was close enough that James could hear labored breathing coming from behind the grotesque pig mask. The breathing was the most disturbing aspect of the entire encounter, not because it was loud or threatening, but because it sounded wrong in a fundamental way, as if the person behind the mask was struggling to breathe through damaged airways, or was experiencing some kind of respiratory distress that made each breath a conscious effort. Combined with the impossible movement patterns and the nightmarish appearance of the mask, the breathing created an atmosphere of wrongness that triggered every survival instinct James possessed, screaming at him to flee immediately, rather than attempting to confront or apprehend the intruder. James managed to reach the hole in the warehouse wall and squeeze through to the outside, where he immediately called for police backup and paramedic support. Though he wasn't sure how to explain what he had encountered or whether the masked figure required medical attention or posed a threat to public safety. While waiting for emergency responders to arrive, James positioned himself at a safe distance from the warehouse and kept watch on the hole in the wall, expecting the intruder to either attempt escape or continue the bizarre, crawling behavior that had made the initial encounter so disturbing. When police officers arrived approximately 15 minutes later, accompanied by K-9 units and a crisis negotiation team that had been dispatched based on James's description of the situation, they conducted a thorough search of the warehouse, but found no trace of the masked intruder. The drag marks in the dust were still visible, confirming that someone had indeed been moving through the building in the manner James had described. But there was no evidence of how the person had exited the warehouse or where they might have gone after James's departure. The most puzzling aspect of the police investigation was the discovery that nothing had been stolen or damaged inside the warehouse, despite the obvious break-in and the intruder's presence in the building for an extended period. The hole in the wall appeared to have been created from the outside using some kind of cutting tool, but there were no signs that the intruder had been searching for valuable materials or attempting to remove equipment or inventory. The lack of any apparent criminal motive made the incident even more disturbing, suggesting that the break-in had been motivated by something other than simple theft or vandalism. Detective Maria Santos, who led the investigation, interviewed James extensively about his observations and experiences during the encounter, paying particular attention to his description of the masked figure's unusual movement patterns and the disturbing quality of the breathing sounds. She explained that the police had encountered similar reports from other security guards and night shift workers in the area, describing encounters with individuals wearing crude masks and moving in ways that seemed to defy normal human capabilities. But none of these incidents had resulted in arrests or identification of the perpetrators. The detective also revealed that the industrial complex had a history of unusual incidents dating back several years, including reports of strange sounds, unexplained lights, and sightings of figures moving through abandoned buildings during overnight hours. Some investigators theorized that the area had become a gathering place for individuals involved in underground activities or alternative lifestyle communities. while others suggested that the reports might be related to urban legends or mass hysteria rather than actual criminal behavior. James's encounter with the pig-masked crawler became part of a growing file of similar incidents that police were investigating as potentially related. Though the lack of physical evidence or identifiable suspects made it difficult to determine whether they were dealing with a single individual, a group of people engaged in coordinated activities, or a series of unrelated incidents that had been connected by coincidence and suggestion. The psychological impact of the encounter affected James's ability to work alone during night shifts, causing him to request reassignment to positions that involved multiple security personnel or day shift coverage. The experience also changed James's perspective on the nature of human behavior and the possibilities that exist beyond the boundaries of normal social interaction, forcing him to confront the reality that some people operate according to rules and motivations that are completely alien to conventional understanding. The image of the pig-masked figure crawling toward him with impossible coordination and disturbing breathing patterns became a recurring nightmare that would wake him in cold sweats for months after the incident. Years later, James still occasionally drives past the industrial complex where the encounter occurred, and he always feels a chill of recognition when he sees the abandoned warehouses silhouetted against the Chicago skyline, wondering whether the pig-masked crawler is still out there somewhere, moving through the darkness in ways that defy explanation and challenging the assumptions of anyone unfortunate enough to cross its path during the vulnerable hours of the night shift. Let's move to our sixth story. And this one takes place in a medical facility where the line between life and death becomes disturbingly blurred in ways that challenge everything we understand about the finality of human existence. Patricia Williams had been working as a night shift nurse at Mercy General Hospital for over 12 years, specializing in post-operative care and patient monitoring in the surgical recovery wing, where her responsibilities included checking on patients who had undergone major procedures and ensuring their vital signs remained stable throughout the critical overnight hours. She had developed a reputation among her colleagues for being unflappable and methodical, the kind of nurse who could handle any medical emergency with calm professionalism and unwavering attention to detail. The incident that would forever change Patricia's understanding of death and the boundaries of medical science occurred on a humid August night when she was assigned to monitor the recovery wing's 20-bed unit, which was operating at near capacity following a particularly busy day in the operating rooms. Most of the patients were recovering from routine procedures like appendectomies, gallbladder removals, and hernia repairs. But bed 14 housed a more complex case. An elderly man named Walter Kowalski, who had undergone emergency surgery to repair a massive abdominal aortic aneurysm that had nearly killed him when it began rupturing during what should have been a routine medical examination. Mr. Kowalski's surgery had been touch and go for over 8 hours, with the surgical team working frantically to repair the damaged blood vessel while managing massive internal bleeding that had pushed the patient to the very edge of survival. The operation had been successful from a technical standpoint, but the patient's advanced age and the severity of his condition meant that his recovery would be uncertain at best, requiring constant monitoring and immediate intervention if complications arose. Patricia had been specifically assigned to check on Mr. Kowalski every 15 minutes throughout the night, documenting his vital signs and watching for any changes that might indicate internal bleeding, infection, or other post-operative complications. During her 11 p.m. rounds, Patricia found Mr. Kowalski resting comfortably, with stable vital signs and no obvious signs of distress, though he remained unconscious from the anesthesia and powerful pain medications that were being administered through his IV line. His heart rate was steady at 78 beats per minute. His blood pressure was within acceptable parameters for someone recovering from major surgery. And his oxygen saturation levels indicated that his lungs were functioning normally despite the trauma his body had endured. Patricia made her standard notations in his chart and continued with her rounds, expecting to find similar stability when she returned for her next check. At 11:15 p.m., Patricia returned to bed 14 and immediately noticed that something had changed dramatically in Mr. Kowalski's condition. Though she couldn't immediately identify what was different about his appearance or the readings on his monitoring equipment, the machines were still displaying the same vital signs she had recorded 15 minutes earlier, showing a heart rate of 78 beats per minute, normal blood pressure, and adequate oxygen saturation. But there was something about the patient himself that triggered her professional instincts and made her approach the bed for a closer examination. When Patricia reached for Mr. Kowalski's wrist to manually check his pulse and verify the readings displayed on the electronic monitors, she discovered something that made her blood run cold and her hands shake with a combination of disbelief and professional horror. The patient's skin was cold to the touch, with the waxy, pale appearance that she had learned to recognize as a sign of recent death. And when she pressed her fingers against his wrist and neck, she could detect no pulse whatsoever, despite the fact that the heart monitor continued to display a steady rhythm. Patricia immediately checked Mr. Kowalski's breathing, placing her ear close to his mouth and nose while watching his chest for any signs of respiratory movement, but found no evidence that he was breathing, despite the fact that the ventilator was cycling normally and the oxygen saturation monitor showed readings that would be impossible in a deceased patient. She used her penlight to check his pupils, finding them fixed and dilated in a way that confirmed her growing suspicion that Mr. Kowalski had died sometime between her 11 p.m. and 11:15 p.m. checks. Yet somehow the electronic monitoring equipment continued to register vital signs as if he were still alive. The contradiction between the obvious physical evidence of death and the continued functioning of the medical equipment created a situation that Patricia had never encountered in her 12 years of nursing experience, forcing her to question either her own professional competence or the reliability of technology that she had always trusted implicitly. She double-checked every connection and cable, ensuring that the monitoring leads were properly attached to the patient and that the equipment was functioning correctly. But everything appeared to be working normally, despite the impossible readings it was displaying. Patricia called for Dr. Martinez, the attending physician who was covering the surgical unit that night, and explained the situation in terms that she hoped would convey the urgency and confusion of what she was observing without making her sound incompetent or delusional. Dr. Martinez arrived within minutes and conducted his own examination of Mr. Kowalski, confirming Patricia's assessment that the patient had indeed died, but expressing his own bewilderment at the continued operation of the monitoring equipment, which showed no signs of malfunction or disconnection. The doctor attempted to explain the phenomenon by suggesting that the electronic equipment might be picking up electrical interference from other sources in the hospital, creating false readings that mimicked normal vital signs. But when he traced each monitoring lead back to its source, he found that they were all properly connected to Mr. Kowalski's body and should have immediately detected the absence of cardiac and respiratory activity. The equipment was functioning exactly as designed. Yet somehow it was registering life signs from a patient who was clearly deceased. As Dr. Martinez and Patricia stood beside the bed, trying to understand what they were witnessing, the monitoring equipment began displaying readings that became increasingly erratic and disturbing, showing heart rates that fluctuated wildly between normal ranges and impossible extremes, blood pressure readings that defied medical logic, and oxygen saturation levels that seemed to respond to some unknown stimulus. The machines would occasionally emit alarms indicating critical changes in the patient's condition. But when they checked Mr. Kowalski's body, they found no corresponding changes in his obviously deceased state. The most disturbing aspect of the entire situation occurred around midnight, when both Patricia and Dr. Martinez observed the patient's body making subtle movements that seemed to correspond with the readings displayed on the monitoring equipment. The movements were barely perceptible, just slight shifts in position and what appeared to be very shallow breathing. But they occurred in perfect synchronization with the electronic displays, as if Mr. Kowalski's body was somehow responding to the false signals being generated by the malfunctioning equipment. Dr. Martinez made the decision to disconnect all monitoring equipment from Mr. Kowalski's body and officially pronounce him dead. But when they began removing the leads and cables, they encountered resistance that seemed to come from the equipment itself, rather than from any mechanical difficulty with the connections. The monitoring leads appeared to be adhered to the patient's skin with an unusual tenacity, requiring significantly more force to remove than should have been necessary. And some of the connections seemed to reattach themselves moments after being disconnected. The process of fully disconnecting Mr. Kowalski from the monitoring equipment took nearly 30 minutes, during which time both Patricia and Dr. Martinez experienced an overwhelming sense of unease and the feeling that they were being watched by an unseen presence in the room. The temperature in the room seemed to drop noticeably during the disconnection process, and both medical professionals reported hearing sounds that resembled whispered conversations, though they could never identify the source or understand the words being spoken. Once all of the monitoring equipment had been successfully disconnected and removed from the room, Mr. Kowalski's body appeared to settle into the stillness and silence that Patricia had expected to find during her 11:15 p.m. check, confirming that he had indeed died sometime during the 15-minute interval between her rounds. The official time of death was recorded as approximately 11:10 p.m. Based on the estimated timeline and the condition of the body, when Patricia first discovered the discrepancy between his physical state and the electronic readings, the incident was reported to the hospital's administration and the medical equipment manufacturer. But no satisfactory explanation was ever provided for the malfunction that had caused the monitoring devices to display vital signs from a deceased patient for over an hour. The equipment was removed from service and subjected to extensive testing, but technicians found no evidence of defects or malfunctions that could account for the false readings. And similar equipment throughout the hospital continued to function normally without any comparable incidents. Patricia continued working night shifts at Mercy General Hospital, but she never forgot the experience of watching electronic equipment seemingly refuse to acknowledge Mr. Kowalski's death, as if some aspect of his consciousness or life force had remained connected to the machines that had been sustaining him during his final hours. The incident reinforced her belief that death is not always the immediate, definitive transition that medical science assumes it to be, and that the boundary between life and death might be far more complex and permeable than anyone fully understands. Years later, Patricia still occasionally thinks about Mr. Kowalski and wonders whether his spirit had somehow become temporarily trapped in the electronic systems that had been monitoring his vital signs, creating a technological bridge between life and death that allowed him to maintain a tenuous connection to the physical world even after his body had ceased to function. The experience served as a powerful reminder that modern medicine, for all its sophistication and precision, still encounters mysteries that defy explanation and challenge our fundamental assumptions about the nature of human existence. Let's move to our 7th story. And this one involves a night shift worker who discovered that sometimes the most innocent-looking situations can hide the most sinister realities. Kevin Thompson had been working various overnight positions for nearly 6 years, bouncing between security jobs, warehouse work, and maintenance duties as he tried to save enough money to finish his college degree and transition into a more stable career. His latest assignment was at a small manufacturing facility that produced custom metal components for the automotive industry, a job that required him to monitor automated machinery, perform basic maintenance tasks, and ensure that production quotas were met during the overnight shift, when most of the regular employees were at home with their families. The facility was located in an industrial park on the outskirts of Detroit, surrounded by similar businesses that operated around the clock to meet the demands of the automotive supply chain. And Kevin had found the work to be relatively straightforward and predictable compared to some of his previous night shift experiences. The machinery ran itself for the most part, requiring only periodic adjustments and quality control checks, and the building was well lit and climate controlled, making it a comfortable environment for someone who had previously worked in warehouses and outdoor security positions, where weather and working conditions could be challenging. Kevin's routine involved walking through the production floor every hour to check on the various machines, documenting their output and performance in a logbook that would be reviewed by the day shift supervisor, and performing minor maintenance tasks like lubricating moving parts, replacing worn components, and clearing any jams or blockages that might interrupt the automated production process. The work was monotonous, but not particularly demanding, allowing him to listen to podcasts or audiobooks while he worked, and giving him plenty of time to study for his remaining college courses during the quieter periods between machine checks. It was during his 3rd week on the job that Kevin first noticed something unusual about one particular section of the production floor, an area where several large stamping machines operated in sequence to shape metal components into precise specifications required by the automotive manufacturers. The machines in this section were older than the rest of the equipment in the facility, dating back to the 1980s when the company had first been established, and they required more frequent attention and maintenance than the newer automated systems that dominated most of the production floor. The unusual phenomenon that caught Kevin's attention involved the positioning of several metal workbenches and tool carts that were scattered throughout the stamping section. Heavy pieces of equipment that required significant effort to move, and were typically positioned according to specific workflow requirements that had been established by the engineering department. Kevin began noticing that these workbenches and carts were being moved during his shift, not dramatically or obviously, but in subtle ways that suggested someone was rearranging the workspace according to some unknown pattern or purpose. Initially, Kevin assumed that the day shift workers were making adjustments to improve efficiency or accommodate new production requirements. But when he mentioned the changes to his supervisor during their weekly check-in meeting, he was told that no modifications had been authorized or implemented in the stamping section. The supervisor seemed puzzled by Kevin's observations and suggested that he might be misremembering the original positions of the equipment. But Kevin was certain that the workbenches and carts were being moved on a regular basis during his overnight shifts. To document what he was observing, Kevin began taking photographs of the stamping section at the beginning and end of each shift, using his cell phone to create a visual record of the equipment positions that he could compare over time. The photographs confirmed his suspicions, showing clear evidence that the workbenches and tool carts were being systematically repositioned during the overnight hours when Kevin was the only person in the building. Yet he never saw or heard anyone moving the heavy equipment, despite conducting hourly walks through the entire production floor. The pattern of movement became more apparent as Kevin continued his documentation over several weeks, revealing that the workbenches were being arranged in increasingly complex geometric formations, that seemed to follow some kind of mathematical or symbolic logic. The arrangements were precise and deliberate, with measurements between pieces of equipment that appeared to be calculated rather than random. And the overall effect created patterns that reminded Kevin of crop circles or other phenomena that suggested intelligent design rather than accidental displacement. What made the situation even more disturbing was Kevin's growing realization that the rearrangement of equipment was occurring during very specific time periods, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., and always when he was in other sections of the building conducting his routine maintenance tasks. The timing was so consistent that it seemed as if whoever or whatever was moving the equipment was deliberately avoiding detection, waiting for Kevin to be occupied elsewhere before beginning the mysterious rearrangement process. Kevin decided to test his theory by varying his routine and spending more time in the stamping section during the critical hours when the equipment movement typically occurred, hoping to catch whoever was responsible for the mysterious activity. On the night he implemented this plan, Kevin positioned himself in the stamping section at 1:45 a.m. and remained there until 4:15 a.m., maintaining constant visual surveillance of all the workbenches and tool carts while pretending to perform routine maintenance tasks that would justify his extended presence in that area. During his vigil in the stamping section, Kevin experienced something that challenged every rational explanation he had considered for the equipment movement phenomenon. At exactly 2:17 a.m., he watched in stunned disbelief as the workbenches and tool carts began moving on their own, sliding across the concrete floor with smooth, deliberate motions that defied the laws of physics and mechanical engineering. The movement was silent and fluid, as if the heavy metal equipment had somehow become weightless and was being guided by invisible forces that operated according to unknown principles. The most disturbing aspect of witnessing the equipment movement was the realization that the workbenches and carts were not being pushed or pulled by any visible mechanism, but rather seemed to be responding to some kind of electromagnetic or gravitational force that Kevin could neither see nor understand. The equipment moved in perfect coordination, maintaining precise distances and angles as they rearranged themselves into increasingly complex patterns that suggested a level of intelligence and purpose that was impossible to reconcile with any conventional explanation. Kevin attempted to document the phenomenon using his cell phone camera, but discovered that the device malfunctioned whenever he tried to record the moving equipment, producing only static images or blank screens despite working perfectly under normal circumstances. The failure of his documentation efforts added another layer of mystery to an already inexplicable situation, suggesting that whatever force was responsible for moving the equipment was also capable of interfering with electronic devices in ways that prevented evidence from being captured. As the equipment movement continued for nearly 2 hours, Kevin found himself experiencing physical symptoms that included dizziness, nausea, and a strange tingling sensation in his hands and feet, as if he was being exposed to some kind of energy field or radiation that was affecting his nervous system. The air in the stamping section seemed to become thick and oppressive, making breathing difficult and creating an atmosphere of unease that made Kevin want to flee the area despite his determination to solve the mystery of the moving equipment. When the equipment movement finally stopped at 4:03 a.m., Kevin found that the workbenches and tool carts had been arranged in a perfect spiral pattern that covered nearly the entire stamping section, with mathematical precision that would have required advanced engineering knowledge and sophisticated measuring equipment to achieve. The pattern was beautiful in its complexity and symmetry, but also deeply unsettling in its implications about the intelligence and capabilities of whatever force had created it. Kevin reported his observations to his supervisor the following morning, providing detailed descriptions of what he had witnessed, along with the photographs he had taken, documenting the equipment positions before and after the mysterious rearrangement. However, when the supervisor visited the stamping section to investigate Kevin's claims, they found all of the workbenches and tool carts in their normal positions, exactly as they had been configured by the engineering department months earlier, with no evidence of the elaborate spiral pattern that Kevin had observed just hours before. The supervisor's inability to find any evidence of the equipment movement led to questions about Kevin's mental state and fitness for the position, particularly given the bizarre nature of his claims and the lack of corroborating evidence to support his account of the events. Kevin was required to undergo a psychological evaluation and drug testing to ensure that he was not suffering from hallucinations or impairment that might affect his ability to perform his duties safely and effectively. Despite passing all of the required tests and evaluations, Kevin's credibility was permanently damaged by the incident, and he was eventually transferred to a different facility where his duties did not include overnight shifts or independent work responsibilities. The experience fundamentally changed his perspective on the nature of reality and the possibility that some phenomena exist beyond the boundaries of conventional scientific understanding, forcing him to confront the limitations of human perception and the inadequacy of technology to document certain types of extraordinary events. Years later, Kevin still wonders about the intelligence behind the equipment movement he witnessed in that stamping section, and whether similar phenomena might be occurring in other industrial facilities around the world, hidden from detection by their subtle nature and the skepticism of witnesses who lack the credibility or evidence necessary to convince others of what they have experienced during the isolated hours of the night shift. Let's move to our 8th story. And this one involves a night shift worker who discovered that nature itself can become a terrifying adversary when it operates outside the boundaries of normal animal behavior. Marcus Rodriguez had been working as a maintenance technician at a large pharmaceutical research facility for almost 4 years, a job that required him to perform routine inspections and repairs on the building's HVAC systems, electrical infrastructure, and security equipment during overnight hours when the facility's research operations were suspended and most employees were safely at home. The pharmaceutical company had chosen to schedule maintenance work during night shifts to avoid disrupting the sensitive experiments and clinical trials that took place during regular business hours, making Marcus's position essential to keeping the facility operational around the clock. The research facility was located on a sprawling campus in rural Pennsylvania, surrounded by several hundred acres of undeveloped woodland that provided a natural buffer between the company's operations and the nearest residential neighborhoods. The isolation of the location was intentional, designed to prevent industrial accidents or chemical spills from affecting civilian populations. But it also meant that night shift workers like Marcus often found themselves completely alone in a vast complex of buildings surrounded by dense forest that could hide any number of potential threats or dangers. Marcus had always enjoyed the solitude and independence that came with working night shifts, finding that he could accomplish more without the distractions and interruptions that were common during daytime hours when the facility bustled with researchers, administrators, and support staff. His duties typically required him to move between different buildings on the campus, checking equipment and systems according to a predetermined schedule that ensured all critical infrastructure remained operational throughout the night. And he had developed efficient routes that allowed him to complete his work, while minimizing the time spent walking across the dark campus between buildings. The incident that would forever change Marcus's perception of the natural world occurred during the 3rd week of September, when he was assigned to perform routine maintenance on the air filtration systems in Building C, a 3-story structure that housed the company's toxicology laboratories and required specialized ventilation equipment to prevent dangerous chemicals from contaminating the surrounding environment. The maintenance work involved replacing filters, cleaning ductwork, and calibrating sensors that monitored air quality throughout the building, tasks that typically took between 2 and 3 hours to complete, depending on the condition of the equipment. Marcus had completed his work in Building C around 1:30 a.m. and was preparing to walk across the campus to Building F, where he needed to inspect the backup generators and test the emergency lighting systems, when he noticed something unusual about the wooded area that bordered the facility's main parking lot. What appeared to be a family of skunks had emerged from the tree line and was moving across the open ground in a formation that seemed deliberately calculated to block every possible path that Marcus might take to reach his destination. Initially, Marcus assumed that the skunks were simply foraging for food in the area around the parking lot, a common occurrence during nighttime hours when these nocturnal animals were most active, and he expected them to disperse naturally as he approached or made noise to announce his presence. However, as he began walking toward Building F, the skunks adjusted their positions in ways that maintained their blocking formation, with adult animals positioning themselves along his intended route while smaller juveniles spread out to cover alternative paths that he might use to circumvent the main group. The behavior was unlike anything Marcus had observed during his 4 years of working night shifts at the facility, where wildlife encounters were common but typically involved animals fleeing when they detected human presence, rather than actively positioning themselves to impede human movement. The skunks seemed to be working together with a level of coordination and strategic thinking that suggested intelligence far beyond what Marcus had expected from these relatively simple mammals. And their persistence in maintaining their blocking formation, even as he changed direction multiple times, indicated that their behavior was intentional rather than coincidental. As Marcus attempted to find an alternative route to Building F, he noticed that additional skunks were emerging from the wooded areas around the campus, joining the original group and expanding their coverage to include virtually every path between the buildings where Marcus needed to work. The animals were not aggressive or threatening in any obvious way, but their coordinated positioning created an effective barrier that prevented him from completing his assigned duties, and their behavior became increasingly bold as they seemed to realize that Marcus was reluctant to approach them closely enough to trigger their defensive spray response. The most disturbing aspect of the encounter was the behavior of the juvenile skunks, which began performing what appeared to be a ritualized pre-spray dance whenever Marcus approached within approximately 20 feet of their position. The young animals would arch their backs, raise their tails, and stamp their feet in a synchronized pattern that clearly communicated their readiness to spray if Marcus continued to advance. But the timing and coordination of their warning displays suggested a level of communication and cooperation that seemed impossible for animals of their supposed intelligence level. Marcus found himself trapped in an increasingly surreal situation where a group of skunks had effectively taken control of the pharmaceutical facility's campus, preventing him from performing essential maintenance tasks while demonstrating behavioral patterns that challenged everything he thought he knew about animal intelligence and social organization. The animals showed no signs of dispersing naturally, and their numbers continued to grow as more skunks emerged from the surrounding woodland, creating a siege-like atmosphere that made Marcus feel like a prisoner in his own workplace. After nearly 2 hours of attempting to negotiate around the skunk blockade, Marcus decided to call his supervisor and explain the situation, though he realized that his account of coordinated animal behavior would sound bizarre and potentially unbelievable to someone who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. His supervisor initially suggested that Marcus was overreacting to a normal wildlife encounter, but when Marcus described the specific behaviors he was observing and the duration of the standoff, the supervisor agreed to contact the facility's security service and request assistance in resolving the situation. The security team that responded to the call consisted of 2 officers who arrived expecting to deal with a routine animal control issue. But they quickly realized that they were facing something far more unusual and challenging than a typical wildlife encounter. The skunks maintained their coordinated formation even when confronted by additional humans. And they demonstrated the same strategic positioning and warning behaviors that had prevented Marcus from completing his work, effectively expanding their control over the campus to include the security personnel as well. One of the security officers attempted to use a high-powered flashlight to startle the skunks and break up their formation. But the animals seemed unaffected by the bright light and actually appeared to use the illumination to improve their coordination, adjusting their positions with even greater precision once they could see each other more clearly. The officers' attempt to approach the animals more aggressively resulted in several of the juveniles releasing their spray in a coordinated volley that created a chemical barrier extending far beyond the normal range of individual skunk defensive capabilities. The coordinated spraying incident convinced all 3 humans that they were dealing with something far beyond normal animal behavior, and they retreated to the safety of Building C to reassess the situation and develop a strategy for regaining control of the campus. From their vantage point inside the building, they could observe the skunks through the windows and document their continued coordination and strategic positioning, which persisted even when the animals were not under direct human pressure or observation. Marcus and the security officers spent the remainder of the night monitoring the skunk activity and attempting to understand the logic behind their behavior. But they were unable to identify any obvious motivation for the animals' coordinated blocking tactics or determine what might cause them to abandon their positions and return to their normal foraging activities. The skunks maintained their formation until approximately 5:30 a.m., when they suddenly dispersed as quickly and mysteriously as they had assembled, disappearing into the surrounding woodland just as the first hints of dawn began to appear on the horizon. The incident was documented in the facility's security reports and shared with local wildlife authorities, but no satisfactory explanation was ever provided for the coordinated behavior exhibited by the skunks during that September night. Some experts suggested that the animals might have been responding to environmental factors such as chemical odors from the pharmaceutical facility or electromagnetic fields from the building's equipment, while others theorized that the behavior might have been related to territorial disputes or mating rituals that were not well understood by researchers. Marcus continued working night shifts at the pharmaceutical facility, but he never forgot the experience of being effectively held hostage by a group of skunks that demonstrated intelligence and coordination far beyond anything he had expected from wild animals. The incident fundamentally changed his perspective on the relationship between humans and wildlife, forcing him to consider the possibility that animals might possess cognitive abilities and social structures that science has not yet recognized or understood, and that the natural world might be far more complex and mysterious than most people realize. Years later, Marcus still wonders about the intelligence behind the coordinated skunk behavior he witnessed that night, and whether similar phenomena might be occurring in other locations where humans and wildlife intersect during the vulnerable hours when most people are asleep, and the natural world operates according to rules and patterns that remain largely hidden from human observation and understanding. Let's move to our 9th story. And this one takes us back to that security guard we mentioned earlier, because there are details about his discovery that are far more disturbing than what we initially revealed. Thomas Mitchell thought the worst part of finding Michael Brennan's body in that executive chair was over, but the investigation that followed would uncover layers of horror that made the original suicide seem like just the beginning of something much more sinister and inexplicable. 3 days after the initial discovery, Detective Sarah Martinez contacted Thomas with information that made his blood run cold and forced him to confront the possibility that what he had witnessed in that Manhattan office building was connected to something far more complex and terrifying than a simple case of workplace suicide. The detective explained that the forensic examination of Michael Brennan's body had revealed inconsistencies that didn't match the apparent suicide scenario, beginning with the trajectory of the gunshot wound and the positioning of the weapon in his hand, which suggested that the attorney might not have been alone when he died. The powder burns on Brennan's skin were inconsistent with a self-inflicted gunshot, and the angle of the bullet's path through his skull indicated that the weapon had been fired from a position that would have been physically impossible for Brennan to achieve if he had been holding the gun himself when it discharged. More disturbing was the discovery that Brennan's access card had been used to enter the building multiple times during the weeks leading up to his death, always during overnight hours and always in the company of at least one other person whose identity remained unknown because the building's security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during each of these late-night visits. The pattern of access suggested that Brennan had been meeting someone in his office on a regular basis, possibly for illegal activities or clandestine business dealings that had ultimately led to his murder rather than suicide. Detective Martinez revealed that the investigation had uncovered evidence of a sophisticated money laundering operation that Brennan had been running through his law firm, involving millions of dollars in illegal funds that were being processed through fake legal settlements and fraudulent real estate transactions. The operation had connections to organized crime families in New York and New Jersey. And investigators believed that Brennan had been killed because he was either trying to expose the criminal network or attempting to steal money from his criminal associates. The most chilling revelation came when Detective Martinez showed Thomas photographs taken at the crime scene that he hadn't seen during his initial interview. Images that revealed details about the office that made Thomas question everything he thought he remembered about that night. The photographs showed that Brennan's office had been systematically searched before Thomas discovered the body, with file cabinets opened, papers scattered across the floor, and computer equipment that had been dismantled and examined by someone looking for specific information or evidence. What made these crime scene photographs so disturbing for Thomas was the realization that none of the searching and ransacking had been visible when he first looked into the office and saw Brennan's body in the chair. The office had appeared neat and undisturbed during his initial observation, with no signs of the extensive searching that the photographs clearly documented, suggesting that either Thomas's memory was completely unreliable or that someone had been in the office cleaning up and rearranging evidence, while Thomas was conducting his security rounds in other parts of the building. Detective Martinez explained that the timeline of events was even more complex than initially believed, with forensic evidence suggesting that Brennan had been killed several hours before Thomas discovered his body, possibly as early as 8 p.m. when Thomas was just beginning his shift. The extended timeline meant that whoever had killed Brennan had remained in the building for hours after the murder, using that time to search the office, remove evidence, and stage the scene to look like a suicide before finally leaving the building through an exit that wasn't covered by the malfunctioning security cameras. The detective's investigation had also uncovered evidence that the building's security system had been compromised by someone with sophisticated technical knowledge, allowing the perpetrators to disable cameras and alarms in specific areas while leaving other systems functioning normally to avoid detection. The selective nature of the security failures suggested that the killers had inside knowledge of the building's layout and security protocols, possibly indicating that they had been planning the murder for weeks or months before carrying it out. Thomas learned that he wasn't the only security guard who had experienced strange phenomena in that particular building, with previous guards reporting unexplained sounds, equipment malfunctions, and sightings of people in areas that should have been empty during overnight hours. The building's management company had a history of rapid turnover in security positions, with most guards lasting only a few weeks before requesting transfers or quitting entirely, citing the stressful and unsettling nature of working alone in the building during night shifts. The detective revealed that the building had been the site of multiple suspicious deaths over the past decade, including 2 other apparent suicides and 1 accidental death that investigators now believed might have been murders connected to the same criminal network that had killed Michael Brennan. The pattern of deaths suggested that the building was being used as a meeting place and execution site by organized crime figures who had corrupted or intimidated the building's management and security personnel to ensure their activities remained hidden from law enforcement. Most disturbing of all was Detective Martinez's revelation that Thomas had likely been in mortal danger throughout his shift on the night of Brennan's murder, with the killers potentially still in the building and aware of his presence while he conducted his rounds. The fact that Thomas had survived the night suggested either that the criminals had decided he posed no threat to their operation, or that they had been planning to eliminate him as a witness, but had been interrupted or deterred by some unknown factor. The detective explained that Thomas's failure to immediately notice Brennan's body during his initial rounds might have actually saved his life, as the killers could have been monitoring his movements through the compromised security system, and might have attacked him if they had realized that he had discovered evidence of their crime. Thomas's assumption that Brennan was simply working late had allowed the criminals to complete their evidence removal and escape from the building without having to deal with a potential witness who could identify them or disrupt their carefully planned operation. As the investigation continued, Detective Martinez discovered that several other security guards who had worked in the building over the past few years had died under suspicious circumstances, including one who had apparently committed suicide just days after reporting strange activities to the building's management, and another who had died in what appeared to be a random mugging, but which investigators now believed might have been a targeted assassination to prevent him from revealing what he had witnessed during his night shifts. The detective warned Thomas that he might still be in danger from the criminal organization responsible for Brennan's murder, as they could view him as a potential threat even though he had no conscious knowledge of their activities or identities. She advised him to vary his daily routines, avoid working alone during night shifts, and immediately report any unusual contacts or surveillance that might indicate he was being monitored by people connected to the case. Thomas's involvement in the Brennan murder investigation fundamentally changed his understanding of the security industry and the risks faced by night shift workers who often find themselves alone in buildings where criminal activities might be taking place without their knowledge. The experience taught him that the greatest dangers during overnight security work might not come from random criminals or emergency situations, but from organized crime figures who view security guards as potential witnesses who must be eliminated to protect their operations. The psychological impact of learning that he had been unknowingly working in a building used by murderers, and that his own life had likely been in danger throughout that terrifying night, affected Thomas's ability to work effectively in security positions and contributed to his decision to eventually leave the industry entirely. The knowledge that Michael Brennan's death was part of a larger pattern of violence and corruption made Thomas realize that some buildings and locations are fundamentally compromised by criminal activities that create ongoing dangers for anyone who works there during the vulnerable hours of the night shift. Years later, Thomas still occasionally thinks about the other security guards who had worked in that building and died under suspicious circumstances, wondering whether they had discovered evidence of the criminal activities and been killed to prevent them from reporting what they had witnessed, or whether they had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time when the organization decided to eliminate potential witnesses to their operations. The Michael Brennan case remains officially unsolved, with the perpetrators never identified or arrested, despite the extensive investigation conducted by Detective Martinez and her team, serving as a reminder that some crimes are so well planned and expertly executed that they leave no evidence trail that can lead law enforcement to the responsible parties, and that the night shift workers who might serve as witnesses to these activities face dangers that extend far beyond the obvious risks of working alone in empty buildings during the dark hours when most people are safely asleep at home. Let's move to our 10th story. And this one takes us to a place where the boundary between the living and the dead becomes terrifyingly thin, revealing secrets that some families have kept buried for generations. The Whitmore family cemetery had been in existence since 1847, nestled on a hillside overlooking the small town of Cedar Falls, Pennsylvania, where 5 generations of the same family had served as groundskeepers and caretakers for the peaceful resting place that held over 300 graves. Robert Whitmore had inherited the responsibility from his father, just as his father had inherited it from his grandfather before him, creating an unbroken chain of stewardship that connected the family to the land and its permanent residents in ways that went far beyond simple employment or duty. The cemetery was renowned throughout the region for its meticulous maintenance and serene atmosphere, with carefully manicured lawns, ancient oak trees that provided shade for mourning families, and a collection of elaborate Victorian monuments that testified to the wealth and prominence of many of the individuals buried within its boundaries. Robert took immense pride in maintaining the cemetery's reputation, working long hours to ensure that every grave was properly tended, every pathway was clear of debris, and every family who came to visit their loved ones found the grounds in perfect condition regardless of the season or weather conditions. Robert's duties as groundskeeper required him to work unusual hours, often beginning before dawn and continuing well into the evening, particularly during the busy seasons when funeral services were frequent and families needed additional support and assistance. He had become accustomed to spending time alone in the cemetery during all hours of the day and night, finding peace and solitude among the headstones and monuments that marked the final resting places of people, whose stories had become part of the cemetery's rich history and his family's legacy of service. It was during a routine maintenance visit on a cold October evening that Robert encountered something that would fundamentally change his understanding of death, burial practices, and the possibility that some aspects of human consciousness might persist beyond the physical boundaries of life. He had been working late to prepare several grave sites for upcoming funeral services, using a small excavator to dig the precise rectangular holes that would receive the caskets of recently deceased community members, when he noticed something unusual about the soil conditions in the older section of the cemetery, where burials dating back to the 1800s were located. The ground in this historic section appeared to have been disturbed recently, despite the fact that no new burials or maintenance work had been scheduled in that area for several months. And Robert could see clear evidence that someone or something had been digging in multiple locations throughout the night. The disturbances were not random or haphazard, but followed a specific pattern that suggested deliberate excavation work conducted by someone with knowledge of the cemetery's layout and the locations of specific graves. As Robert investigated the disturbed areas more closely, using his flashlight to examine the soil and debris scattered around several headstones, he discovered something that made his blood run cold and his hands shake with a combination of disbelief and professional horror. 7 graves had been completely excavated during the night, with the caskets removed from their burial sites and arranged in an impossible vertical stack that rose nearly 30 feet into the air. creating a tower of death that defied every law of physics and engineering that Robert understood. The caskets had been stacked with mathematical precision, alternating between horizontal and vertical orientations in a pattern that created perfect structural stability, despite the enormous weight and awkward dimensions of the wooden and metal containers. The arrangement was so precise and deliberate that it would have required sophisticated engineering calculations and heavy machinery to achieve. Yet Robert could find no evidence of equipment tracks or mechanical assistance anywhere in the cemetery grounds. What made the discovery even more disturbing was the realization that the excavation and stacking of 7 caskets would have required many hours of intensive labor, involving the movement of tons of soil and the manipulation of extremely heavy burial containers. Yet Robert had heard absolutely no sounds during the night, despite living in a house located less than 200 yards from the cemetery entrance. The work had been completed in complete silence, without the noise of machinery, voices, or even the basic sounds of shoveling and digging that should have accompanied such extensive excavation work. Robert immediately contacted the local police department and the county coroner's office, reporting what he described as the most serious case of grave desecration and vandalism in the cemetery's 175-year history. But when the authorities arrived to investigate his claims, they found something that challenged Robert's account and raised disturbing questions about his mental state and reliability as a witness. The 7 graves that Robert had reported as being excavated and disturbed were completely intact, with no signs of recent digging or soil disturbance. And there was no evidence of the impossible casket tower that he had described in vivid detail. The police officers and coroner's investigators conducted a thorough examination of the entire cemetery, using metal detectors and ground-penetrating radar to search for evidence of recent excavation work. But their equipment confirmed that all graves remained undisturbed and that the soil conditions were consistent with normal settling and weathering over many decades. The investigators found no footprints, tool marks, or other physical evidence to support Robert's claims about the overnight grave desecration, leaving them to conclude that he had either fabricated the entire story or was suffering from some form of psychological breakdown that had caused him to experience vivid hallucinations. Robert's insistence that he had witnessed the impossible casket tower and the evidence of extensive excavation work led to questions about his fitness to continue serving as the cemetery's groundskeeper, particularly given the sensitive nature of his responsibilities and the need for families to have confidence in the security and integrity of their loved ones' final resting places. The cemetery's board of directors ordered a complete psychiatric evaluation and temporarily suspended Robert from his duties while they investigated the incident and determined whether he posed a risk to the cemetery's operations or reputation. The psychological evaluation revealed that Robert was suffering from severe stress and sleep deprivation related to his intensive work schedule and the emotional burden of caring for a cemetery that held deep personal and family significance. But the examining psychiatrist found no evidence of mental illness or delusional thinking that would explain the detailed and consistent nature of his account of the grave desecration incident. Robert's description of what he had witnessed remained unchanged despite repeated questioning and attempts to identify inconsistencies or contradictions in his story. During the investigation, Robert learned from his elderly uncle, the previous groundskeeper who had retired 5 years earlier, that similar incidents had occurred periodically throughout the cemetery's history, always involving the mysterious excavation and rearrangement of graves in patterns that seemed to defy explanation or logical purpose. His uncle revealed that the Whitmore family had developed an unspoken policy of not reporting these incidents to authorities, understanding that the supernatural nature of the phenomena would not be believed and could damage the cemetery's reputation and their family's credibility as caretakers. The uncle explained that the grave disturbances seemed to occur in cycles, typically during the autumn months when the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was believed to be at its thinnest, and that the incidents had been documented in private family records dating back to the 1890s. The patterns of excavation and casket arrangement varied from incident to incident, but they always demonstrated the same impossible precision and structural engineering that Robert had observed, suggesting that whatever force was responsible for the phenomena possessed intelligence and capabilities far beyond human understanding. Robert's uncle also revealed that the cemetery had been built on land that had previously been used by Native American tribes for burial and ceremonial purposes, and that some members of the Whitmore family believed the mysterious grave disturbances were connected to spiritual forces that predated the establishment of the Christian cemetery by many centuries. The indigenous burial ground had never been properly consecrated or relocated when the Whitmore Cemetery was established, creating a situation where two different burial traditions and spiritual practices existed in the same location, potentially causing conflicts or interactions between different types of supernatural energies. The family records maintained by previous generations of Whitmore groundskeepers contained detailed descriptions of the grave disturbance incidents, including sketches and measurements of the various casket arrangements that had appeared over the decades. And Robert was amazed to discover that his own experience matched almost exactly an incident that had been documented by his great-grandfather in 1923. The consistency of the phenomena across multiple generations suggested that Robert had encountered something that was an integral part of the cemetery's supernatural character, rather than an isolated incident or psychological episode. Armed with this family history and the knowledge that he was not the first Whitmore to witness the impossible grave disturbances, Robert was able to convince the cemetery's board of directors that his account deserved serious consideration, rather than dismissal as the product of mental illness or fabrication. The board agreed to allow Robert to return to his duties as groundskeeper, but they also implemented new security measures, including motion-activated cameras and electronic monitoring systems designed to document any future incidents and provide objective evidence of supernatural activity. Robert continued serving as the cemetery's groundskeeper for many more years, and he experienced several additional incidents of mysterious grave disturbances, though none as dramatic or extensive as the 7-casket tower that had first introduced him to the cemetery's supernatural secrets. The security cameras and monitoring equipment consistently malfunctioned during these incidents, producing only static images or blank recordings that provided no useful documentation of the phenomena, confirming Robert's belief that whatever forces were responsible for the grave disturbances possessed the ability to interfere with modern technology and avoid detection by conventional means. The experience fundamentally changed Robert's understanding of his role as cemetery groundskeeper, transforming him from a simple maintenance worker into a guardian and witness to supernatural phenomena that connected the present day to centuries of spiritual activity and unexplained occurrences. He came to view the mysterious grave disturbances not as violations or desecrations, but as manifestations of spiritual energies that were an integral part of the cemetery's character and history, requiring respect and understanding rather than fear or attempts at prevention. Years later, Robert still serves as groundskeeper of the Whitmore family cemetery, and he has trained his own son to eventually take over the responsibilities and continue the family tradition of stewardship and witness to the supernatural phenomena that make the cemetery a place where the boundaries between life and death remain permeable and mysterious, reminding all who visit that some aspects of human existence transcend the physical limitations of mortality and continue to manifest in ways that challenge our understanding of reality itself. Let's move to our final and most disturbing story, one that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about death and what happens in those sterile chambers where we say our final goodbyes. This account comes from a cemetery groundskeeper whose family had owned and operated the same burial ground for 5 generations. A man who thought he had seen every possible aspect of death and burial, until he encountered something that shattered his understanding of the boundary between life and the grave. The Riverside Memorial Cemetery had been in the Henderson family since 1892. Passed down from father to son through 5 generations of dedicated groundskeepers who took pride in maintaining the peaceful resting place for over 2,000 souls. Marcus Henderson had grown up among the headstones and monuments, learning the family trade from his father and grandfather, and he had always found comfort in the quiet dignity of cemetery work, helping families through their most difficult moments while ensuring that their loved ones' final resting places remained beautiful and well-maintained throughout the changing seasons. The cemetery's crematorium had been added to the facility in 1967, a modern addition that allowed families to choose cremation services without having to transport their loved ones to distant facilities in the city. Marcus had been trained in the operation and maintenance of the cremation equipment, understanding the precise temperatures and timing required to complete the process with dignity and respect. And he had overseen hundreds of cremations during his 23 years as head groundskeeper, always ensuring that families received their loved ones' ashes in a timely and respectful manner. It was during a routine cremation on a gray November afternoon that Marcus encountered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life and fundamentally change his understanding of death and the possibility that consciousness might persist beyond the physical boundaries of life. The deceased was an elderly woman named Eleanor Vasquez, who had passed away peacefully at age 87 after a brief illness, and her family had requested a simple cremation service, followed by burial of her ashes in the cemetery's memorial garden, where her husband had been interred 3 years earlier. Marcus had prepared Mrs. Vasquez's body according to standard protocols, ensuring that all medical devices and jewelry had been removed, and that she was positioned properly within the cremation chamber before beginning the process that would reduce her physical remains to ash and bone fragments. The cremation had proceeded normally for the first 30 minutes, with the chamber reaching the appropriate temperature of 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, and the automated systems monitoring the process to ensure complete and efficient combustion of organic materials. It was at the 37-minute mark that Marcus first noticed something unusual happening inside the cremation chamber, something that made him question his own sanity and everything he thought he understood about the nature of death and the cremation process. Through the small observation window in the chamber door, Marcus could see that Mrs. Vasquez's body had begun moving in ways that defied every law of physics and biology that he understood, thrashing violently against the intense heat and flames as if she were somehow fighting against the cremation process itself. The movement was not the normal shifting and contraction that occurs when organic tissues are exposed to extreme heat, but rather deliberate and purposeful thrashing that suggested consciousness and awareness, despite the fact that Mrs. Vasquez had been pronounced dead by a physician over 12 hours earlier and had shown no signs of life during the preparation process. Her arms and legs moved in coordinated patterns that seemed to indicate she was trying to escape from the cremation chamber, and her head turned from side to side as if she were looking for a way out of her burning prison. Most disturbing of all were the sounds that began emanating from inside the cremation chamber. Sounds that Marcus described as attempts to scream despite the absence of vocal cords or respiratory system that would make such vocalizations possible. The sounds were muffled and distorted by the intense heat and the sealed chamber. but they had the unmistakable rhythm and desperation of someone trying to call for help, creating an audio nightmare that made Marcus's hands shake as he watched the impossible scene unfolding before his eyes. Marcus immediately shut down the cremation process and opened the chamber to investigate what was happening. But when the intense heat and smoke cleared, he found Mrs. Vasquez's body in the exact position where he had placed it before beginning the cremation, showing no signs of movement or disturbance despite what he had just witnessed through the observation window. The body appeared to be in the normal state of partial cremation that would be expected after 37 minutes of exposure to extreme heat, with no evidence of the violent thrashing and struggling that Marcus had observed just moments before. Confused and deeply disturbed by what he had witnessed, Marcus decided to restart the cremation process and continue monitoring the chamber to determine whether the strange phenomena would recur or whether he had somehow misinterpreted what he was seeing through the observation window. Within minutes of restarting the cremation, the violent thrashing resumed with even greater intensity, accompanied by the same muffled screaming sounds that seemed to come from someone who was fully conscious and aware of what was happening to them despite being medically dead for over 12 hours. The thrashing and screaming continued for over an hour, forcing Marcus to repeatedly stop and restart the cremation process as he tried to understand what was causing the impossible behavior and whether there was any way to complete the cremation without subjecting Mrs. Vasquez to what appeared to be conscious suffering during the process. Each time he stopped the cremation and opened the chamber, he found the body in a normal state with no signs of movement. But each time he restarted the process, the violent struggling would resume within minutes. Marcus eventually called Dr. Patricia Henley, the physician who had pronounced Mrs. Vasquez dead, and asked her to come to the crematorium to examine the body and confirm that death had indeed occurred, explaining that he was experiencing unusual difficulties with the cremation process that required medical verification before he could proceed. Dr. Henley arrived within an hour and conducted a thorough examination of Mrs. Vasquez's body, confirming that she had been dead for at least 13 hours and showing no signs of life or neurological activity that could explain the phenomena that Marcus had described. However, when Dr. Henley observed the cremation process through the observation window, she witnessed the same violent thrashing and heard the same muffled screaming sounds that had so disturbed Marcus, confirming that the phenomena were real and not the product of his imagination or stress-induced hallucinations. The physician was unable to provide any medical explanation for what they were witnessing, acknowledging that the behavior was impossible according to everything she understood about death and the cessation of consciousness and bodily functions. The cremation of Eleanor Vasquez ultimately required over 6 hours to complete, with multiple interruptions and restarts, as Marcus and Dr. Henley struggled to understand and cope with the disturbing phenomena that accompanied the process. The violent thrashing and screaming continued intermittently throughout the extended cremation, sometimes stopping for periods of 20 or 30 minutes before resuming with renewed intensity, as if Mrs. Vasquez's consciousness was fighting against the destruction of her physical form with every resource available to her disembodied spirit. When the cremation was finally completed and Mrs. Vasquez's ashes were collected and prepared for burial in the memorial garden, both Marcus and Dr. Henley were emotionally and psychologically exhausted by the experience, having witnessed something that challenged their fundamental understanding of death and the possibility that consciousness might persist beyond the physical boundaries of life in ways that medical science has not yet recognized or understood. Marcus reported the incident to the cemetery's board of directors and the state regulatory agency that oversees cremation facilities. But his account was met with skepticism and suggestions that he might be suffering from job-related stress or psychological issues that required professional counseling. The cremation equipment was inspected and tested by certified technicians, but no mechanical problems or malfunctions were identified that could explain the unusual phenomena that Marcus and Dr. Henley had witnessed. Dr. Henley documented the incident in her medical records and reported it to the state medical board. But she was advised to avoid discussing the case publicly due to the potential impact on her professional reputation and the lack of scientific explanation for the phenomena she had observed. The medical establishment's reluctance to acknowledge or investigate the incident left both Marcus and Dr. Henley feeling isolated and unsupported in their attempts to understand what they had experienced. The Eleanor Vasquez cremation became a defining experience in Marcus's career as a cemetery groundskeeper, fundamentally changing his perspective on death and the cremation process while creating lasting psychological trauma that affected his ability to perform cremations without experiencing anxiety and distress. He began refusing to work alone during cremations, requiring the presence of at least one other person who could serve as a witness and provide emotional support if similar phenomena occurred in future cases. Marcus eventually discovered that other crematorium operators throughout the region had experienced similar incidents involving deceased individuals who appeared to regain consciousness or awareness during the cremation process. But these cases were rarely reported or discussed due to the professional and personal risks associated with making claims that contradicted established medical and scientific understanding of death and consciousness. The experience taught Marcus that death might not be the immediate and final transition that most people assume it to be, and that some aspect of human consciousness or spirit might persist beyond physical death in ways that can be observed and documented under certain circumstances, particularly during processes like cremation that involved the complete destruction of the physical body that had served as the container for that consciousness during life. Years later, Marcus still serves as groundskeeper at Riverside Memorial Cemetery, but he approaches each cremation with a mixture of professional duty and personal dread, knowing that he might again witness evidence that death is not the peaceful end that families hope for their loved ones, but rather a transition that might involve suffering and awareness that extends far beyond the moment when medical professionals pronounce life extinct. If you've made it this far through these 11 disturbing tales, you've proven that you have the stomach for the darkest truths that the night shift has to offer. But these stories are just the beginning of what's out there. Waiting in the shadows of hospitals, cemeteries, office buildings, and industrial facilities, where brave souls work alone during the hours when most of us are safely asleep in our beds. I need you to do something for me right now. If these stories have affected you the way they've affected me, if they've made you question what you thought you knew about the boundary between life and death, then smash that subscribe button for Verified Fears and ring that notification bell, because I have dozens more accounts just like these, each one more terrifying than the last. And here's what I really need from you. If you work the night shift yourself, or if you know someone who does, share your own experiences in the comments below. The security guards, nurses, maintenance workers, and cemetery groundskeepers who encounter these phenomena need to know they're not alone, that others have witnessed the impossible and lived to tell about it. Your story could be the next one I investigate and share with our growing community of people who understand that the darkness holds secrets that most people will never believe. Don't let these stories end here. Subscribe now, because the night shift never sleeps, and neither do the horrors that wait for those brave enough to work when the rest of the world is dreaming. The dead don't always stay buried, the machines don't always stay silent, and the darkness is never truly empty. Welcome to Verified Fears, where every story is true, and every truth is more terrifying than fiction.